this episode of China Unscripted. China supports Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Xi Jinping solidifies his grip on power, and protests erupt across China. That and more of the biggest China stories of 2022. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And it's a new year, so that means we're going to look back at the past year in China, and there were some pretty big things that happened in China.
Should we really dwell on the past, Chris, though?
What better way to look to the future than to understand where we came from?
That's something that the Chinese Communist Party actually wholeheartedly disagrees with, I think.
That's true. Well, what about the remembering 70 years of glorious Communist Party tradition? Chinese...
Or 100 years of CCP rule?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely looking back at an accurate look at the past.
They like looking back at the past, just with certain viewpoints.
With red-colored glasses?
That's good. Well, where do we want to begin with the biggest stories? I mean, I think one of the big stories that really came out over this past year was that China was setting up police stations in other countries without them knowing.
Oh, I mean, they weren't police stations, right? They were overseas police service stations.
Just helpful policemen helping Chinese people abroad get kidnapped.
Renew their driver's licenses.
By going back to China first under duress.
Yeah, I mean, this was a big escalation of over the years we've seen like Operation Skynet or Operation Fox Hunt, where the Chinese Communist Party is going abroad and capturing Chinese people that it wants to get a hold of. But I mean, this police station thing was on a whole new level. In particular, I couldn't believe that. Well, I mean, one, this is the reason why most countries don't have extradition treaties with the Chinese Communist Party.
And really, they've been very smart at finding a way around that. So who needs an extradition treaty?
Well, what was so ballsy about this is that's basically what they said. It's like, yeah, like there is an extradition treaty, but like it's just so much red tape. We just figured it's easier to just take the people. Like they actually were saying this.
I mean, they literally kidnapped the head of Interpol, who was Chinese, a couple years ago. So, they obviously don't really care about international police cooperation.
No, I mean, this is just another one of those things of like clearly the Chinese Communist Party does not care about agreements, international norms, and yet it seems like people or governments continually think there's a chance that they'll follow laws.
I wonder if there's some kind of almost like plausible deniability with these overseas police stations, because they were not set up by the central government. They were set up by like the provincial police stations in different provinces and sometimes in the counties. So it's kind of like, oh, well, this was like a local government thing, like that these, it was just, Wenzhou and Fujian.
Maybe we should ask the Chinese central authorities for their help in cracking down on this.
Yeah, they got to bring their own provinces into line, right?
I think Xi Jinping will agree to that.
Well, I think this is also especially significant, and we'll get to these stories at the end, but like this was a big year of protests in China, but also overseas Chinese people joining in the protests. So I think these Chinese police will have a lot of unsavory overseas Chinese that need some cracking down on.
I mean, so far they've used the excuse that like, oh, they're cracking down on like phone scammers and things like that. So we don't have any evidence yet that they're actually going after dissidents or whatever, but you can definitely see the line that this is going down.
Yeah, I mean, we just have evidence of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association pressuring Chinese students, or all the other mountains of evidence we have that, overseas Chinese people get harassed by the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, yeah, I'm just saying that the police stations haven't been caught doing it yet.
Specifically?
Yes. No. And, when you have things like, what was that case where the FBI recently arrested this Chinese student for basically harassing and stalking another Chinese student in Boston.
Yeah.
For putting up posters that were like pro-Chinese democracy.
Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah, and that kind of thing is like they don't even have to use their police stations.
That's true.
And I don't think that, Chinese student understood that he was actually breaking the law in the U.S. Like he probably felt like, oh, well, I'm just doing my patriotic duty.
Like the Chinese ambassador in the UK who grabbed the Hong Kong
In
protesters.
Manchester, right?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
was like the consul general in Manchester who was like, "It is my duty to pull his hair."
What was wrong about that?
Yeah, it's. I mean, he was insulting my country, therefore I can pull his hair.
It's
Yeah. Well, the
you know,
crazy part is that guy's eventually probably going to get a new and even possibly better post.
Oh yeah, because he was recalled, right, by China.
Yeah, but it's like he's demonstrated, more important than following the law of the host country, he's demonstrated his loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party's ideology.
His Wolf Warrior Initiative.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very appropriate about calling it a host country because the Chinese Communist Party is a parasite infecting the hosts around the world. I like that. It's really, I like the idea of calling the Communist Party like a parasite. It gives this, diseased, kind of filthy connotation to
Nice
it.
try,
It's
Chris,
like,
but you're not gonna. Nope.
They're very dirty.
Nope.
These
Nope.
communists.
Nope.
Communists
Nope.
are represented by red a lot. It's like a dirty red.
Well, I'm glad you're starting the new year off right, Chris, by trying to make me say something that I'm just never gonna say.
Wait, say what? I don't understand. what this
You
is
know
about.
full well.
Well, speaking of things that never really got off the ground, Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Ooh.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I mean that was another big China story, and I don't think necessarily people connect Russia's invasion of Ukraine with being a China story, but it was actually significant for China in a lot of ways. I mean, first of all, I think a lot of people have forgotten sort of China's hand in the whole invasion to begin with. Like for months before the invasion happened, the Biden administration had been warning Russia was going to invade, and had even spoken directly to Chinese officials, giving them information about Russia, and saying, "Hey, this is going to happen. Can you talk to them?" Just like how successfully you've been able to talk to North Korea and get them to.
I mean, we
never
don't
do
know that they
ballistic
said that, but essentially.
No. I'm being facetious there. But yeah, they wanted China to say something to Russia. And the Chinese officials were like, no, it's crazy. You're over-exaggerating. And then they gave all that information to Russia.
Yeah, that the U.S. was warning China that Russia was going to invade.
Yeah. And then supposedly they were asking Russia to delay the invasion until after the Beijing Winter Olympics.
Yeah, that was also something that came out of the U.S. government. So there's a filter there, but I wouldn't be surprised if that conversation happened.
Yes, definitely. Because they met, Putin and Xi met right at the tail end of the Winter Olympics, I think, or right before.
And didn't Russia do something? Didn't they do a special military operation during the Sochi Olympics in 2014?
Oh, yeah, I think there was
That's,
something.
Crimea.
It was Crimea, right? Yeah. So basically, they had a history of doing that. So I could imagine Xi Jinping pulling Vladimir aside and being like, "Hey, don't rain on our parade over here."
Well, actually, he probably wanted that because there was no snow in the Beijing Winter Olympics, so at least a little rain might have helped.
Don't worry, they had the artificial snow.
They had the artificial snow. That didn't make one of our top 10 stories.
Oh
of
my
the
gosh,
year,
that feels so long ago, doesn't
but-
it?
No, it does.
Yeah, although also Russia's invasion of Ukraine was end of February. So it was
that was a good way to kick off 2022.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all basically forgotten about the Beijing Olympics, but also they had less of an impact than the 2008 Beijing Olympics, because that was kind of like, China's debutante ball. They're sort of, coming out into the world ceremony. Whereas 2022, it's kind of like people are already kind of annoyed at China for, covering up COVID. And
Well, it's also the Winter Olympics, and nobody cares about the Winter Olympics, which seems strange to me since there is a sport where you ski and then shoot something. That seems like the coolest thing around.
yeah, no, I agree with that. There's also the one where it's, what is it? The shuffle. What do you call it?
curling?
Curling.
You're
Yeah.
comparing curling to shooting guns?
What's
Yeah.
what is that one called?
Biathlon.
Biathlon, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is not a good name for it.
There's
Right.
only 2 athlons
Yeah.
in it.
Well, I mean, it just sounds like a track event.
Right, exactly. But anyway,
Most events, I think, would be improved by the presence of guns.
I think
pole vaulting.
Yeah. Quick. And well, it gets you prepared for if there's a communist takeover and you have to get over the wall they build.
So anyway, Russia invades Ukraine, and now China is like, hey, come to us to help negotiate a ceasefire because we, China, are friends with Russia.
Well, we should probably not do anything to upset China so they don't, to ensure that they still help us with Russia, right?
Yeah, I think so.
That's probably a good way to get what we want.
Yeah, let's definitely not, put any kind of trade restrictions on them or criticize them for covering up.
I do have to say that doesn't seem to be the trap that the U.S. is falling into.
Sure.
Although I think part of the reason is that because they're essentially trying to use Ukraine to weaken Russia as much as possible, so they're not yet interested in.
Yeah, I've heard that analysis. That's why it's just another way to kind of bankrupt Russia. Although I think it is clear that the Russians' military is not quite what everyone feared.
I do think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been very bad for China's ambitions to invade Taiwan.
Well, that is the other big thing that came out of it, because suddenly people started taking China's threat to invade Taiwan a lot more seriously. And the whole idea of this sort of globalist world order, no conspiracies here, but the idea that you could have change the definition of freedom to include just free trade, and you could work with authoritarians like Putin or Xi Jinping or any of the Chinese Communist Party leaders. That doesn't work in the long run. It just gets you, like Germany found, it gets you completely dependent on Russian oil and natural gas, and then when that gets disrupted, inevitably, you're in trouble.
Yeah, but before that, you can make money.
That's true.
And yet the EU is very hesitant still to back the U.S. when it's trying to crack down on China's semiconductor industry and things like that. The EU has definitely been dragging its feet and trying to kind of play the middle here.
EU, more like PU. It's the dirty reds they smell. This is pretty good. I'm starting off 2023 on a pretty good footing.
That is still up for discussion.
Well, I have a year to figure that out. But yeah, that also brings us nicely into one of the other biggest stories of the year, I think. It was when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. Very much in the context of this Russia-Ukraine kerfluffle.
Well, she visited back in
August,
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
She was going to visit earlier in the year, but then she got COVID, so she didn't go.
But what surprised me about the whole Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan thing is the amount of pressure put on her by White House officials to not go.
Yeah, that was kind of shocking.
It was not a good look for the Biden administration.
No. Well, neither is the 4 times now Biden has said the U.S. would defend Taiwan if China invaded. And
then people in his administration are like, no.
Yeah, we're not changing U.S. Taiwan policy.
Yeah.
No, not even Taiwan. One China policy.
Yeah. I mean, what he's saying isn't necessarily even has to do with the one China policy in a certain way. It has nothing to do with who's China or not, right? What he said was just that, we will defend Taiwan if China invades, and that's just, going too far for certain, bureaucrats or...
Yeah, it's really... I mean, we'll get to this in a bit when we talk about Biden's China policy, because that was unveiled this year. That was another one of the big stories. But, yeah, you really see sort of this dissonance in the U.S. government and U.S. society more broadly about, people who understand that the Chinese Communist Party, is a genocidal regime using rape as a form of torture, who has dedicated itself to destroying America, and the people who think they can make money there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi understands the problem with the Chinese genocide stuff, and she, to her credit, has been talking about Tibet as an issue since the 90s, back when that was cool to talk about. And she kind of quieted down a bit during the sort of Bush-Obama years.
I don't know if she was that vocal during when Bill Clinton was pushing for the WTO stuff either.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember. I was pretty young then. I'd like to think so. But yeah, I mean, but at any rate, she's kind of come back in force and has been, pretty outspoken about that stuff. And so that is to her credit. And it's not just Pelosi who visited Taiwan, although she's the highest profile person, because a number of other members of Congress have visited Taiwan this year.
Dozens of congressional delegations that have gone to Taiwan this year.
And not just from the U.S. There's actually been a lot of pretty high-ranking officials from a lot of other countries visiting Taiwan, too. Because, again, I think in the context of Russia invading Ukraine, people realize that it's not – when China says they want to invade Taiwan, it's not just empty talk.
Yeah, and that has much more of the possibility of immediately bringing in like Japan and South Korea. Like it starts to affect all of Asia very, very quickly.
Yeah. And, it'd be nicer to help prevent an invasion of Taiwan than have to hang Taiwanese flags on our porches after the invasion happens.
Hey, but at least we'll be doing something, Chris.
That's right. Hey, you know what? Maybe I'll change my Facebook profile to having the Taiwanese flag. Really be making a stand then.
That's a great idea. Well, the U.S. is increasingly showing its support for Taiwan. The latest National Defense Authorization Act is more pro-Taiwan, basically allocated up to $2 billion in loans so that Taiwan could buy American military equipment, which is a little bit of like a self-serve thing too, because it's like, I'm loaning you money to buy stuff from me and you still have to pay me back.
It's win-win mutual cooperation.
That is kind of belt and roadie. Yeah.
It is. So I think it's a little funny how that's written, but nonetheless, just the idea that like, yeah, we're authorizing Taiwan to like, we want to do this trade with them.
Also having the whole thing about like the U.S. military should invite them to RIMPAC.
That, I think, was the most significant thing in the new Defense Authorization Act.
Yeah, because the U.S. has never done joint military operations with Taiwan, at least since Taiwan was disinvited from the United Nations, right? And so RIMPAC is basically a large-scale joint military exercise between a whole bunch of countries. I think last year it was like 8 or 9 countries.
Doesn't matter. U.S. is the best, most important one.
And I agree with that. But adding Taiwan, it's not that we're necessarily going to do it, but at least there's like the suggestion to do it.
Yeah, just suggested it. So that might not happen at all.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean, that's been a politically sensitive thing for years now.
Right. But I mean, keep in mind, just like, 6-7 years ago, the U.S. was inviting the Chinese People's Liberation Army to join RIMPAC. And
yeah, that's a special kind of stupid.
It was really dumb. And it was happening during the Obama years. And then, the Trump administration at some point was just like, actually, China, you're disinvited. And they were angry. It angered China. But, Trump, like Honey Badger, did not care.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that China, like the Communist Party's People's Liberation Army, would be in RIMPAC makes RIMPAC such a joke. It should be called RIMShot.
I knew you were going somewhere with that.
I think that's not bad. I mean, it's like on my level.
2023, it's my year.
Yeah, I guess your New Year's resolution is not about using fewer puns.
But like any country that joins RIMPAC gets to understand how the American military operates, right?
Kind of. So, I mean, it's kind of like, I think we had a guest on the podcast once talk about how like RIMPAC is like a showy thing, so it gets like the most attention in terms of inviting Taiwan there would be a statement. But he was like, I don't know that's the actual real,
right?
The most useful thing.
Right. His suggestion was actually bilateral joint military operations, and we should do those. But realistically, RIMPAC is a first step in that, and it's going to anger China, and that's okay. It's okay. We just have to sort of sit with that feeling of discomfort.
Yeah, I remember when Pelosi visited Taiwan, like all the articles were like, Pelosi visits Taiwan, angering China.
Yeah, everything that has to do with Taiwan is always angering China.
But China is like Bruce Banner.
It's always angry.
I do have to give Pelosi credit for this, which is that she told the Washington Post that, or someone from her office leaked this to the Washington Post, that she had told White House officials that she would not go to Taiwan if Biden called her and personally asked her not to go, but then she would also tell the media that she was not going because Biden called her and personally asked her to not go. So it was a very neat way to kind of prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, she's got chutzpah, and I'll give her that.
Yep. All right. So I think this now goes very nicely into the unveiling of the Biden China policy, because this all ties in. After a year and a half, Biden finally unveiled the China policy, which better late than never, better never late.
I mean, I think it's a little unfair to expect them to have one like from day one, but a year and a half is a while.
I would expect it from like 6 months though, instead of 16 months.
I think it was technically Antony Blinken, right?
Who did the speech unveiling it. And even that got delayed a bit because I think he got COVID too.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Which the great thing about 2023 is it's looking a lot like 2020.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Oh, goodness, we'll get to that. But yeah, so in Antony Blinken's speech, like there were a lot of good things. And overall, I think the Biden administration has done some very good things when it comes to China. But so like in Blinken's speech, he talked about, China's human rights violation.
He used the G word.
He specifically said, China, it's committing genocide. But we still got to work with them, right?
Or
we don't want to anger them.
I think it was kind of more like, because there was also part of it where he was like, we don't want a Cold War with China. We're not trying to keep China down, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it was like almost trying to firewall the speech against like CCP propaganda that would say those kinds of things. But it doesn't really matter. They're going to say that stuff anyway.
Yeah, and it really just kind of it revealed the fundamental problem of the Biden administration in regards to China, the failure to realize that the Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist state. It already considers itself at war with the United States. It's not something that can be we can't peacefully coexist with it.
I think there was a lot of like, oh, well, we could, if only the Chinese government would come to the, liberal international order. He didn't use those words, but like the idea was essentially that like they could join the international order and be one of the good guys. They just have to make the decision to do that.
Yeah, except that the last 20 years of working with China has shown that what actually happens is the liberal world joins China's new world order and takes on sort of Chinese ideas of mass surveillance and, the lockdowns that happened through COVID was a very Chinese idea.
And we just get very dependent on them. The same thing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Countries around the world were very dependent on Russia. And being dependent on an authoritarian regime is not a good idea. And like the whole idea that I always say this, China uses rape as a form of torture. I don't think telling them like, hey, that's not nice. That's not going to change things. It's not like they're like, oh, I didn't realize it was not nice.
No, Chris. Bullies respond to polite requests.
Well, I mean, I do think we have to understand that the speech is made in the context of like, it's a diplomatic speech by the State Department. So it's going to be
wishy-washy? I mean, I don't think that follows necessarily.
No, I think there is definitely, even when Pompeo was in charge of the State Department or whatever, there did...
Oh, he called them communist. He was one step away from calling him, what's that phrase, Shelley?
Nope. But my point is...
I don't think he said nope. He called them...
Nope, he didn't even say anything close to that. So, nice try. But... like, you have to be like, oh, well, if they wanted to change, then sure, fine. You know what I mean? So I don't think that's the part that's the problem. I think the part that's the problem is that, like, you have these opposing forces within any administration when it comes to China. You have the people who are going to be, like, they're always called China hawks, right? Mm-hmm. Like the people who understand the actual dangers of the Chinese Communist Party.
Typically, these are people more in like defense,
like national security. Yeah. And then you have the people who are like the
The commerce.
engagers, the
The
whatever.
John Kerry's.
Doves.
Like, yeah, the people who are like, oh, well, we should just try to, like, let's not, like, decoupling is so harsh. Like, maybe there are still industries when we can work together, even though we're now trying to basically shut down their entire semiconductor industry.
But
as
we
far
have
as
to work with
possible.
them on climate change, Shelley.
Actually, there are signs that the Biden administration is going to try to. I don't know if they're going to be as successful at this, but they're going to try to limit China's technology when it comes to climate stuff and biotech.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, made a speech a few months ago that kind of indicated some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think a lot of people paid attention to it. I certainly didn't. And then there was an article in Politico last week that definitely was kind of like a plant article by the Biden administration that was like about how the Biden administration is getting really tough on Chinese trade. But it pointed out that like the Biden administration is about to do a bunch of things that focus not just on the semiconductor stuff, like not just on quantum computing. I think actually there was something recently about quantum computing that the Biden administration did too. But they're also going to go and look at the biotech stuff and the like climate green technology stuff and try to limit China's ability to take over those industries too for national security reasons.
Interesting. And I mean, yeah, let's talk about some of the good things. Like, Congress passed the CHIPS Act, and then Biden also made his executive order that limited China's access to, U.S. semiconductors, and that really had a huge impact on their economy and in that field. I'm blanking on the other thing that happened. The making Chinese companies delist on the stock market if they don't actually allow audits to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that has been so long coming that I think that whole thing was maybe started in the Obama administration.
Yeah, but because it's crazy that any foreign company that lists on U.S. stock markets has to be audited. But China just said, nah, that's all state secrets.
And basically they would let the Chinese arms of these like Western companies, like they would let the Chinese arm or Chinese partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers audit their books, but not the actual American firm. And you can never take the books out of China and nobody would actually know what they said. So like that Chinese firm would be like, everything's cool. And you'd have to just trust them.
And then Luckin Coffee committed massive fraud on the scale of $300 million. And it's like, oops. They did pay a fine for it, but I think the fine was only $180 million. So it was like they really got only a slap on the wrist for an incredibly massive fraud, and a fraud that probably would not have happened if the PCAOB, the U.S. regulator, had been allowed to actually get access to their books ahead of time.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't be allowed to list.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're trying to relist again, which is stupid.
Well, yeah, I mean, so the pressure was on, and they were going to kick all these Chinese companies off of the U.S. stock exchange, but then the CCP actually bowed to real pressure.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
a lesson.
that was the culmination of a long time and I think that is a lesson that like if you have something that the CCP wants badly enough, and they came to the realization that they didn't actually want 200 plus Chinese companies to get kicked off the U.S. stock market, then they will actually bow and do something that they're supposed to be doing in the first place.
What is strange is there is a lot of continuity in the U.S. government in regards to China, and we're seeing the Biden administration take a lot of actions against trade in China. Also, and we'll get to it more later, with the potential new surge of COVID coming from China. There's the U.S. is also making Chinese travelers submit a positive test,
Or
the negative
test.
Hopefully.
positively negative. And these are very similar to things that happened in the Trump administration, but the U.S. media is reacting very differently.
Well,
to a lot
no,
of this.
don't worry, Chris. They still called that racist. We'll get to that a little later.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I was worried that something wouldn't be labeled racist.
Don't worry, CNN came through.
Thank you. Hey, you know what else happened this year? CNN Plus. Was that what it was called? CNN Plus?
Was it called that? I can't even remember. The thing that totally crashed and burned, right? Yeah. Turns out that people don't want to pay an extra streaming subscription to watch CNN personalities like cook or whatever that was going on.
Who'd have guessed? Who'd have guessed? So yeah, I think to sum up the Biden administration China policy, there is a lot of cause for celebration and cautious optimism, I think.
Well, I mean, I think we have to keep a good eye on what they're doing, and like they don't have a free pass. You know what I mean?
No, definitely
There's
not.
always there. Like I said, the danger is that like as the CCP maybe is going to wise up a little bit in the next few months as they try to rebuild their economy, they might start to act more conciliatory. Like they might back off the wolf warrior stuff a little bit, and if that happens, are we going to fall for it again?
That'll be
yes. Yes. I'd like to fall for it again.
It's like falling in love.
You want to be consistent at least. Well, so one of the it's not just zero COVID that was crashing the Chinese economy this year, because one of the earlier things that had been crashing China's economy is the sort of massive failure of Evergrande, which actually happened at the end of 2021, but really kind of came to fruition in 2022.
Don't worry, the government's going to bail them out.
Yeah, but there were these massive protests in the summer where people were like, because they bought their, like Evergrande and other real estate companies had sold apartments that hadn't been built yet, but people wanted to get them early, so they pay up. And theoretically, that money is supposed to go towards that specific apartment building. But in reality, Evergrande was using them to complete earlier projects and essentially turning it into a pyramid scheme where there was never actually the money for the current thing.
90% of new homes in China are pre-sold like that.
Which is crazy that you would be like, all right, well, I'm going to start paying a mortgage towards something that doesn't exist yet.
Yes.
Right. But there's such a craze for real estate in China.
Well, because like for a long time, you couldn't invest in anything else.
Right.
Yeah, that's why it's like 30% of the GDP.
But then now that you can invest in other stuff, a lot of real estate companies are getting involved in that too, which is like all these like loan products, right? Which is part of the reason that Evergrande failed. It wasn't just their like the stupid way that they were doing real estate projects. It was also that they were speculating in the like kind of the loan market where you would basically loan your money to Evergrande and they would promise you some crazy double-digit return.
Yeah. I mean, when could repackaging loans into complicated collateralized debt obligations ever cause a problem down the line?
I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure it's as complicated as that was, right? It was kind of like people were loaning their money to Evergrande, which was promising the return, but Evergrande wasn't using them to sell and repackage as other debt. They were essentially using that to fund the real estate stuff.
As far as we know.
Yeah, as far as we know. But anyway, the point is that like when the real estate stuff starts to collapse, then all this money that people were loaning to Evergrande also started to blow up. So you had even Evergrande employees protesting because they were forced to buy all of these like loan products essentially. Mm-hmm. And then they were like, I want my money back. Like, not only am I not getting paid, but like, you have my money.
It was a big year of protests. And yeah, people were out protesting this. And there were even cases of when people were going to go to the area where the protest was of their, COVID apps suddenly mysteriously turning red. And that meant they couldn't access, subway
that was the
transportation.
Henan Bank one.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, bank failure is not an unknown thing in China now, too.
No.
But it
reminds me of It's a Wonderful Life.
The good thing about the mortgage protest is that a lot of it was like people just basically boycotted paying their mortgages.
Yeah, they just stopped paying.
So this is a kind of protest that it's very hard for the CCP to stop. Mm-hmm. It's not like you can go stop a bunch of people on the street or you can keep them from traveling because their COVID app turns red or something like that. It's like literally, how are you going to force them to pay it?
Yeah, like arrest them.
Well, I have a solution to that, which is China's new digital renminbi currency. So once China fully implements its digital RMB, then they'll have direct control over everyone's money, no matter where it is.
So they could just take it from you whenever they want to.
They'll just help you repay the mortgage as they feel you are obligated to do. So I'm a big fan of the government controlling digital currency. By the way, I think that's a great way to make sure that people don't have the freedom to do terrible things like protest.
That's true. Well, I know in response to the mortgage protest, the CCP was like, "All right, we'll let you not pay mortgages for 6 months." It's like you're already not paying. we'll let you not pay.
Yeah. I mean, and we'll also crack down on the Evergrandes and other real estate companies by loaning them money.
Yeah. Let's solve debt with more debt.
Yeah.
It really is like, what's the Simpsons thing about digging a hole?
Oh, it's dig up, stupid.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. This is the thing about the Chinese Communist Party and how it runs the economy. It's like a boat on the water, and it's sinking, and there's a bunch of holes spouting water, and they're like desperately trying to like stick their finger in the holes. And so far, they've done a pretty good job of it. They got a lot of fingers.
Yeah, but they also have
tentacles.
they have a lot of foreign money
Yes.
that is bailing out the water in the boat.
It's like sponges
Yeah.
absorbing
Yeah.
the sea of debt.
Yeah. So
Well, and that's why American companies like BlackRock should keep investing in China.
Yeah.
Because it'll keep these problems at bay.
especially since BlackRock is investing other people's money.
Yes. Well, that's the trick. Always invest the sucker's money and not your own.
Yeah, that's probably very true. But hey, you know who we really have to thank for this wonderful economic relationship between China and the U.S.?
Henry Kissinger?
Maybe. But also that great reformer.
Oh, I see where
That
you're going.
pinnacle of a man, Jiang Zemin, who died this year. That's one of the other big stories. Yeah. This situation is largely because of his colorful antics and the willingness of Western powers to ignore all the genocide.
Like, it's almost crazy because Jiang Zemin, he sort of rose to power after he supported the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. And after Deng Xiaoping died in the mid-90s, Jiang basically fully took over. And there's all this like footage and photos of Bill Clinton with Jiang Zemin, and like they're sort of working together. And Jiang was like, yeah, like we love working with the West, and it'll help us
He
reform.
could recite the Gettysburg Address.
I mean, he could speak English too.
I mean, that comes with reciting the Gettysburg
Yeah,
Address.
well, no, you could have just phonetically memorized it. Sure.
Well, I mean, he could speak some English. I'm not sure how super fluent he was, but he liked to drop English phrases.
So naive. He became a meme.
Yes. And actually, after he died, a lot of people were posting that video clip on YouTube. I mean, on Twitter. I understand. I mean, we put that on YouTube and it has like millions of views.
Yeah, where he's just like freaking out at like a Hong Kong reporter who asked like a pretty banal question. He's like, yeah. That's the one where he's doing like this crazy.
But the point is, he got Western companies to invest, and moreover, he got the leaders of the free world to agree that it was the right thing to do to let China into the World Trade Organization, which opened the door for massively more
They would
investment.
eventually reform.
I think it's like when Deng Xiaoping put on the cowboy hat. Remember that like photo of Deng in the cowboy hat as this
don't.
like, it's used as an iconic like, oh, China's changing now after Mao. Like Deng Xiaoping, the guy who started the reform and opening up stuff, right? He's wearing a cowboy hat. Jiang Zemin wearing a tricorn hat from like when he was in Colonial Williamsburg. Just the idea that, oh yeah, like China's going to become more like us. Yeah.
How'd that work out?
Technically true in some ways.
Right. And we also became more like China.
Yeah, so that is how.
Yes. So among other things, he basically launched the persecution of Falun Gong in the late 90s, and the whole, state-sponsored killing people for their organs and then selling those organs at state-run and military hospitals.
And not just that, but like we know this was something we found out from China researcher Ethan Gutman, that like Jiang built the Great Firewall, not personally, specifically as a means of like preventing Falun Gong practitioners in China from like getting stories out of the Chinese internet.
Yeah, and what's interesting is like all the mechanisms that Jiang Zemin set up to go after this, spiritual practice in China, right? So he sets up. So there's the mass surveillance, the internet firewall, the organ harvesting system, and now they're being used against all these other groups, and especially the Uyghurs. Right?
Well, I mean, you can't let a good mass surveillance system go to waste.
Yeah, but like once Jiang built these systems, they don't go away. They might target new people.
Yeah, they're definitely not going to go away because the CCP does not do truth and reconciliation, right? Like they don't look back on their past and go, whoops, that was a mistake. We should never do this again. There's none of that. So you run out of Falun Gong people because you've
killed them all for their organs, and now you go after the Uyghurs.
Then you have to find a new group to use it against.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think even a lot of the zero COVID kind of surveillance wouldn't be there if that infrastructure hadn't been built with the persecution of Falun Gong, the persecution of Uyghurs, the general persecution of dissidents in China.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly the mass internet censorship, which was sort of pushed forward by Jiang Zemin's desire to stop Falun Gong from spreading information.
I do think, though, that like no matter who was in charge and for what reason, eventually the CCP would have gotten there.
Oh yeah,
because,
I would agree with that.
There's
it wasn't
no
just
way for the CCP to survive without that type of censorship apparatus.
Well, yeah, it's like the people who think Xi Jinping is the problem, and he is, but the bigger problem is the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. I mean, to a degree, it's like Jiang Zemin and Xi Jinping have used the CCP as their tool for repression, but also the CCP has used them.
It's like, don't hate the player, hate the game.
Yes.
So the CCP is the game?
Yeah.
Okay. That's beautiful, Chris.
This analogy tracks, trust me.
Yeah. So anyway, Jiang Zemin's dead. But it doesn't change anything really in terms of China still being a terrible authoritarian regime.
But it is interesting to kind of speculate how it might affect the people's favorite communist soap opera, General Hostility, because Xi Jinping and Jiang Zemin were in a pretty intense political power struggle. Now that Jiang's dead, what will that mean? I think that goes nicely into the next topic.
Okay. Well, we're not going to talk about what that means.
Well, we can talk about it in the context of Xi Jinping this year, also becoming another 5-year term, presentator for life.
Well, maybe.
Maybe.
I mean, it's called a 5-year term, but also we're saying he's going to lead for life, which is to say that the terms themselves is really just a mechanism and not some kind of like constitutional or legal restriction. It's more like a suggestion. And then, if you have enough power, you can manipulate it to your will.
Yeah, and for Xi to have gotten this third quote-unquote term means he's got a lot of power. You want to say something, Shelley. 2023, be the year where you don't hold it in. Let it out.
Well, I mean, the thing about Xi Jinping and the terms is like, yeah, he has enough power to do that, but is he all powerful? I think that a lot of the analysis after he got his third 5-year term in Western media was like, he is all powerful now. There is no one to stand in his way.
It's like
we live in Xi Jinping's world now,
It's like at the end of Aladdin.
Okay.
Where Jafar wished to become a genie, and he had unlimited power, but then like those things clamp on his wrists, and you realize, oh no, he's actually been chained.
So you think Xi Jinping's been chained?
I think so. He's chaining himself to the rise and fall of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's not looking great for the Communist Party.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of speculation back in 2012 when he first came to power, and not a lot was known about him, and he was kind of a quote-unquote compromise guy between like Jiang and Jintao's people, and the idea was like, oh, maybe he will reform. I think like every time that a new CCP leader comes up,
we've been saying
always...
it for so many years. Maybe this will be the one who'll actually reform.
So then when he started to make all these speeches and talk about, the importance of communism and how we can't forget like the importance of, like all of the stuff. And then I think there is still a little bit of denial about it, even in Chinese dissident circles, about like, oh, maybe he's just saying it.
You know the biggest river in China?
The Yangtze.
The Yangtze.
No. It's denial.
Uh-huh. Well, yes, I knew what you were going for.
Thank you for humoring me.
Yeah, that was like a Matt level joke, Chris.
Oh, good. So you got it.
Yes, I got it.
Good.
Anyway, but like, Xi Jinping has talked multiple times now about how Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet Union by capitulating to all this political reform stuff and how the CCP can never do anything like that. So,
yeah. Though I am curious, like, I don't think anyone really knows what Xi Jinping wants necessarily, like, because most of these, past 10 years has been him in a power struggle, just trying to not get purged himself. And even today, as we said, he doesn't have absolute power. There's lots of, challenges facing the Chinese Communist Party, especially in the next year. So, like, what will he do when he feels secure? Like, what is his end goal? Is it just to make it to the end of his life?
He just wants to sit in the shade and eat some honey.
Oh.
If only history would allow that.
Yeah. No, he's gonna
delicious
crash.
Xinjiang honey made from.
But no, he's gonna crash and burn with the Chinese Communist Party eventually if he lives that long. So
Well,
that's his fate, unfortunately for him. But he kind of had multiple opportunities, I think, to actually implement reform as we in the West would see it or hope for. And he has not taken any of those opportunities. And in fact, he's doubled down on his faith in the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you think, though, Matt, that if maybe we just invested a little more money, Xi Jinping might have a change of heart?
That's a good idea. I'm going to move some money to BlackRock.
You'll thank me later. But yeah, I think some things that we should look for moving forward as far as like the general hostilities side of things is what happens to Zheng Qinghong.
Oh,
right? That was Jiang's right-hand guy.
Well, no, his right-hand guy that's still not in prison yet.
Yeah, his right tentacled talon monster claw guy.
Yeah, so Zheng Qinghong is like, I guess, the de facto head of the Jiang faction now.
Yeah, so if he ends up in jail or like a piano falls on him.
Then we'll know we're living in a Looney Tunes cartoon.
I feel like we're already living in Looney Tunes, Shelley.
Yeah. But unfortunately for Xi Jinping, his glorious rise to power was overshadowed by the next big story, everyone freaking out that Hu Jintao was openly purged in a Stalinist kind of way in the middle of the National People's Congress.
Look, he just
Chris,
wanted those papers.
Who's Hu Jintao? I have no memory of this person.
Who?
Jintao?
I'm not as clever as those guys were.
Abbott and Costello.
Abbott and Costello. Yeah, I mean that was crazy. Well, it also reminded me that like right before the Congress, there was like those rumors of a coup against Xi Jinping, and everyone was freaking out about that. And that was a case where we were like, I don't think this is real. Everyone calm down. And then there was also kind of with this Hu Jintao purge, everyone was like, oh my gosh, it's like Stalin. And we were also kind of like, I don't know.
I think the thing is that it's so boring, these meetings, that anything that happens that's not rehearsed.
Yeah, at the start, what was it? Somebody like doing something about talking about the tea or the tea leaves? There was some like crazy thing where somebody was trying to make a statement about like what the tea at the party meant or something really big.
Oh yeah, people were speculating about weird stuff like I forget what I kind of remember what we were talking about, but I forget what the specific thing was. It's like how Xi Jinping was drinking tea during his speech, I think.
Well, the reason the party Congress is so boring is that everything that happens in the party Congress has already been pre-decided through months or years even of power struggling. So it's like all they're doing is going through the forms. They're not actually voting on anything. They're not actually discussing anything in any meaningful way whatsoever. It's just like the final piece and the public piece of like a much larger thing.
Oh no, I found it. It was from CNN as well. Here's why Xi's subtle gestures during speech worries people.
Yes. So that was right. Like he was like drinking tea a lot during a speech or something like that.
And there was also some crazy take about how like Xi Jinping's authoritarianism represents whiteness. Do you remember that? That was like some commentator in Australia.
Oh, right. It was like a really weird article about how like.
Oh yeah, here it is. It was from ABC. Stan Grant. To understand China, you need to understand whiteness, yet it's missing from the conversation. And it was this weird, like, twisted logic where...
I think the guy, like, his thing is kind of that, you know what I mean? So he was applying it to this. It's like...
It was bad. So, yeah, the point was that, like, that's where the reporting was.
I mean, I don't think you can call this reporting. This is just like
that was
opinion article writing, and
until Hu Jintao was like practically picked up and dragged away.
I mean, I don't know if he was picked up and dragged.
They crushed him into a ball
and dribbled
it.
Because this is a Looney Tunes cartoon. Yeah, I mean, he was obviously like confused and not doing well. So then you had the people who were saying it's because he was sick, and other people being like, oh, it's not. There's something else going on. And then we were like, it could be both.
Yeah, and like he was seen like I think later that week at a party meeting. His son like gave a speech somewhere.
He was featured on the CCTV news.
Yeah, that day. Which these are things that aren't happen. These don't happen if somebody was actually purged.
Yeah, he was at Hu Jintao was at Jiang Zemin's funeral prominently. Yeah, like it's so. Yeah,
like I think that was again one where like our calm, level-headed Looney Tune analogies won the day. Am I right? Why do I have Looney Tunes in my head? Oh, I've been watching Babylon 5.
That has something to do with
one
Looney
of the
Tunes?
Characters has like a particular fondness of Looney Tunes, which is weird because that's like a 500-year-old show at that point. But hey, I mean, I guess like some people like, you know, Shakespeare is like 1,000 years old or something.
Not quite.
Shakespeare is a 500-year-old show at this point.
Not quite.
Highly recommend Babylon 5.
Closer to you.
I highly recommend Shakespeare. He was actually like good at writing stuff. It was really interesting back in the day, you know, when I used to go to his shows at the Globe.
I'm not even sure what that joke is supposed to be about. Are you a vampire? Is that what the...
No, Shelley, the world is a vampire.
Smashing Pumpkins reference, everybody.
Yeah.
I really should just stop talking, maybe sort of lock down my jokes.
Was anything else locked down this year, Matt?
No. Was that Scooby-Doo?
I started to do Looney Tunes, but you know.
That was Scooby-Doo, right?
That if I had to say that was anything. Shanghai locked down for 2 months after the CCP said they would not lock down Shanghai. Well, initially they were like, "Oh, we'll temporarily lock down half of the city, then the other half
for 5 days.
For 5 days
each.
Total city lockdown 2 months."
Yeah, I mean, I think this was the case in which the local party officials effed up a little bit. And then,
what happened to the local party officials? He got promoted in the National People's Congress.
Yeah, because he was like a Xi Jinping guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Usually this would mean he gets purged, but, you know, his loyalty to Xi Jinping actually got him a higher promotion. Yeah.
Let that be a lesson.
Don't worry about competence. Just worry about loyalty.
A suck up?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Not so wise, Shelley.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've worked in corporate America.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, like really the Shanghai lockdown was sort of like the perfect microcosm of the entire zero COVID.
Yeah. Like, remember there was that guy who was like dead and being carried away, and he was in a body bag, and then it turned out he was still alive.
I do
Oh
remember
yeah.
that.
I forgot about that actually.
That was nightmarish.
He was in a gurney and they were wheeling him out, and then the body bag started moving and people freaked out, and this was all on camera.
Yeah, which also considering how many body bags we're seeing in China now.
That's
I
a
hope we
little
don't see those.
worrying.
Yeah. They don't really check if you're dead.
I
But
mean,
it doesn't matter because
how-
they'll make sure in the end you're dead.
Yeah. Oh, it's kind of like Monty Python and the Holy Grail during the plague, and guy goes around and he's like, bring out your dead, and people pile on the bodies, and the guy's like, oh, I'm not dead yet. And
And then don't they like bean him or something?
Oh, he's like, oh, you will be soon.
It's like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you saw, there was food shortages, people dying in lockdown, not being able to get medical treatment. And these were things we'd seen in a lot of other Chinese cities as well.
But also the fact that it happened in Shanghai was a shock to people.
Because, I mean, that's like one of the richest, most prosperous cities in China. It's got a lot of the middle and upper class of Chinese society.
It's their shining beacon of how great China is.
Yeah, really. That's supposed to be like, hey, look how great China is. Come invest. Come invest.
City,
Yeah.
lots of expats.
And I think it was so intense because people in Shanghai had seen very publicly like what was going on in the other places. I think Xi'an was another like a very high profile one where a lot of stuff was captured on camera.
That was last December
Yeah.
when they had like a 3-week lockdown or something like that.
Yeah.
But Shanghai had it worse, I think. Well, for one, because it was 2 months, but also because I think there was a lot of political pressure on Shanghai. So like it became such like a focus of censorship and repression in terms of like trying to censor all the stories that were coming out of Shanghai. It was just like, and then people getting very mad about that and like really fighting back against that censorship.
Yeah, and the party really just doubling down on zero COVID is Xi Jinping's thing. We're not changing this. Full steam ahead.
We're never going to change zero COVID. It totally works. Look at how great China is.
And, well, the party knew zero COVID had to end, I think, at some point.
I mean, if they started by changing the definition of zero COVID to meaning zero community spread.
Oh, they did that in
which
Xi'an.
Right.
Yeah.
So like they had already started doing some of the shenanigans like a year ago when they were like, it doesn't count if there are people who still have COVID, but they're already in quarantine.
Yeah, or like what was it, zero COVID on a local level?
Yeah, it's all the different words for the same thing, which is like, essentially like once you get hauled away to a quarantine camp, it doesn't matter if you get COVID or not because you're not going to count. And so the focus was on just hauling as many people away to quarantine as possible. So Chinese people started getting more afraid of quarantine than COVID.
Especially as video came out of like those being horrible places or people dying there.
I mean, a lot of people go to quarantine camps and they did not have COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have been much worse if like they were really, really high infection zones. But like it was like a lot of it was just like terrible sanitation. Like if you were sick, it's not somewhere you want to be. There's no doctors and nurses. There was the case
the
like
bed
a few
sheets were
months
not
ago.
even necessarily washed.
Yeah, like you might be reusing old like blankets from another person who just left, and you don't know whether they were sick or not. There was the case of like a young girl who died in a quarantine camp because she started having like seizures or something. There was no medical staff at this quarantine camp, and her relatives weren't able to get her help in time, essentially. But like for the most part, it wasn't that these places were hotbeds of COVID. It was just like the whole thing was so terrible that nobody wanted to have to go there.
I mean, the worst part was probably that that bus carrying people who did or even didn't have COVID, carrying them off to a quarantine center, and then that bus crashed and killed dozens of people.
Yeah, that was definitely a major escalation in like sort of the pressure cooker of zero COVID. It had been building a lot over the years, and then the bus crash. That was a big one.
Yes.
That was a big one.
Because what's one of those things where like that could be me.
Yeah.
Because it's not any of those people's fault that they got on the bus because they were essentially forced to.
Yes.
under the zero COVID policy.
And like we said, we're talking about that, like they would just quarantine. And like if there are cases where if there was one person in your apartment complex, not even in your apartment building that got COVID, sometimes entire complexes were hauled off to quarantine. Like it didn't matter because if you could be considered a close contact of someone, like all those crazy videos of people like fleeing IKEA and Costco and things like that.
Yeah.
When like somebody had tested, like somebody had gotten like a red flag on their COVID app like earlier that day at some point in the store. So now they're going to lock down the store and everybody's running for the exits. Like that is kind of that was the environment that everybody was operating in.
And then that kind of led to the Bridgeman protest right before the National People's Congress.
Yeah, I would say that you're right in that Shanghai was like the first big domino to fall in this. But yeah, like things like the bus crash were big, like all of these things that the CCP was trying to keep people from finding out about.
And then there's that apartment fire in Xinjiang.
But before that, I think the Bridgeman was a significant turn in the whole zero COVID thing. Where that guy who was quickly arrested, put up those banners, complaining about things, complaining specifically about the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping.
Well, like one of his set of banners were specifically about like, we don't want COVID tests, we want freedom. Like a lot of things like complaining about like the zero COVID stuff. And then another banner was basically like, Xi Jinping like step down.
Yeah.
Essentially.
And then that message was, repeated throughout China. People were scrawling it in bathrooms, and it became known as like the toilet revolution, since bathrooms are the only place in China where there are no surveillance cameras yet. And also Chinese people abroad also began doing the same thing. And this was really like, I think that was like a big turning point where people started to get the idea, oh, we're all upset. Because the Chinese Communist Party and communism in general likes to divide people, make them afraid of each other. And this was a moment where people realized, like, oh, no, I'm not alone. We're all kind of on the same page.
Yeah,
right
even
now.
for overseas Chinese students, say at a university in the US or the UK, somewhere to post some of that, like that same language on posters around the campus or to attend a demonstration, like that is ballsy for them because like they will, like we mentioned earlier, in the episode, like they could get, reported to authorities in China. That was what that guy who got arrested by the FBI was trying to do. He was trying to get the other Chinese pro-democracy person like in trouble, like get their family in trouble with Chinese police in China.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What a snitch.
But so there was a fire in the Xinjiang apartment building, and the official death toll is 10, but probably at least 40-some people died. This is reporting from like Uyghur dissidents and things like that who had like people who had multiple family members die in the same fire.
Even though it was supposed to be mainly Han Chinese people in the apartment building? Am I correct in that?
I don't know if that's true.
Okay.
I mean, the apartment building was in Urumqi. But like there was, I think, like credible reports of at least like one Uyghur family, including kids, that were like 6 of them died or something. So that alone is counting for 6 people, right? And then so I think the death toll was definitely larger than 10, but we don't have an exact number.
And this was a situation where like the COVID workers were kind of blocking the fire trucks from getting in.
I don't think it's that clear exactly what happened in terms of whether it was the COVID workers blocking it or if the fire trucks got delayed in general because of like the COVID policy. I don't know if it was like the COVID workers at that building stopping the fire fighters, because like that building was visibly on fire. Like there were video taken from other apartment buildings of that building, and you can hear people screaming.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it was like that clear cut as to exactly why they got delayed, but people across China saw this, and it led to this like this huge moment of rage, because it's just like the bus crash where people were like, oh, that could be me.
Yeah.
And like it was, people were comparing it, like it started online actually, and people were comparing it to like when Dr. Li Wenliang died, the COVID whistleblower guy who got in trouble for texting a group of other doctors about COVID. He wasn't even trying to like publicly warn people about anything. And then he got taken in by the police department and warned. and then he eventually ended up dying of COVID. And after that happened, there was this like huge amount of rage from the Chinese people online, and the CCP kind of had to just let it happen because they couldn't keep a lid on it. And that's kind of what was happening after the fire in the apartment building.
Yeah, the
that
mass protests
there
all
was
over China.
Yeah, before even people went on the street, there was like a huge buildup of anger online that almost couldn't be censored. Like they were trying to censor it as much as they could, but people were fighting the censorship. So there was like more and more outrage building online, and then that kind of spilled over into in-person protests all around the country. Often from young Chinese people in places like Shanghai and Beijing.
Yeah, which a lot of people kind of just wrote them off as being, little pinks or nationalistic, brainwashed because of, a couple decades of patriotic education by the Communist Party after the Tiananmen protests, largely led by students.
I mean, these are people that were not alive
Yeah.
during the Tiananmen protests, so.
And probably never heard of it.
No, very likely.
Yeah. Now, if only the Communist Party hadn't, covered up all mentions of the Tiananmen Square massacre, then maybe those young people this year would have been afraid to come out and protest. But they weren't. They were too bold.
What was called the blank paper revolution, the white paper revolution, the A4 revolution.
Oh, yeah.
Like different words, but like because people were holding up blank pieces of paper, as a protest against the censorship. And in Shanghai, literally people were calling for the CCP to step down and Xi Jinping to step down.
Yeah. And I think what was interesting about this is, anytime there's like when we were in Hong Kong or when you see protests like this, there's always people like, okay, when are they going to send in the tanks? And the CCP has evolved past that in a lot of ways. Like they're smarter about how they repress.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't think they had riot police in 1989. You know what I mean? Like that just wasn't a thing in China.
Yeah. And like the system of surveillance, they're just able to arrest people after the fact. So you don't have like a visible martyr.
Right. And I think one of the lessons the Communist Party took from Tiananmen is that the problem with what happened in Tiananmen Square is that Western media were able to film it. And they filmed some of the violence that are happening in Beijing near the square. And they also filmed Tank Man, and it became iconic. And now everyone's got their, mobile phones shooting video. And so like it's so easy for one, too violent move by the CCP or by the police to become this video of a martyr or to have this big international impact. So the trick is to not let things escalate to the point where people are able to get video of it and post it online.
I mean, I think Chinese people also understand the power of a video, right? Which is why so many people, like they're always filming. Like you always see, whenever there's a protest, you see everybody with their phones up because everybody knows that like, okay, you have to record it so that people know this happened. And this was happening also when people were getting hauled away to quarantine and stuff like that. They would be posting videos of like the terrible quarantine conditions and being like, please let other people know about this. Like, like they understand that video is incredibly powerful for, showing people what's actually happening.
Right. And this is why, we're not seeing riot police in China just opening fire on protesters, because that would be captured on video. And the CCP understands the danger of that, and that will become a political problem that they would have to deal with. Then other countries are like, oh, well, they're actually shooting people
Yeah,
now.
I mean, like that might make people hesitate like 2 whole weeks to pump money into China.
I know, and they can't afford those 2 weeks, Chris.
That's possible, very possible.
Which is, again, why. So, like, what are they doing? They had sort of let they censored a lot of it, but they couldn't censor everything. And they let some of it kind of happen. But then afterwards, they were doing things like, tracking down using, people's cell phone GPS or surveillance with face recognition. They were tracking down people who were at the protest. And they would do things like threaten them or invite them to the police station to discuss things, or even arresting them. But they don't even have to necessarily do that, because people get the idea that like they'd been to one protest. They thought that they were anonymous because they were wearing a mask and maybe even a hat. But the fact is the CCP knew they were there, and and basically was like, yeah, if you do this again, it's going to be big trouble. So that's terrifying. And in many ways, it's more terrifying than going to a protest where, your chances of being shot are 1 in 1,000. And if you're not one of those people, you can get away, right? But in this case, no matter what, like, you're never going to get away because they know you were there.
And it also, like, instead of being tied to a group of people, it also, once again, isolates people. But I think the real challenge that the CCP will be facing in the new year will be the fact that so many Chinese people now are resentful of the regime and of Xi Jinping and know that they aren't alone.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, like, people may get the impression that protests work, since China then
backed off the zero COVID.
Backed off zero COVID very quickly.
Which I guess kind of leads us into some speculation of the coming year. Because COVID is definitely spreading very quickly in China. There's lots of comorbidities. COVID hasn't really moved through the population the way it has in the rest of the world. There's no kind of herd immunity.
They say they have a 90% vaccination rate, but that rate is much less in older people.
Yeah.
And also China's vaccines are probably not that super effective against current COVID variants.
I mean, even the best vaccines in the West.
No, we can't talk about that. Don't talk about that, Matt. We'll be canceled.
Vaccines are perfect.
Thank you.
But
approved by the CDC.
We are going to get one of those little boxes under this one, aren't we?
Probably.
But yeah, I find it interesting that there have been certain WHO officials who have come out and said that COVID was already spreading, was already starting to explode.
Yes.
Before they scrapped the zero COVID policies.
And I think especially for us, we need to remember to keep saying that point, because that's something that I'm sure the Communist Party will love to sweep under the rug.
Yeah. And I think the guy who said that actually was one of the people who, in the beginning of the pandemic, was one of the WHO guys who was praising China's COVID.
Interesting.
Policies, and was like, if I had COVID, I'd want to be in China.
Oh, it was that guy?
Yeah, it was that guy.
Wow.
And now even he's coming out and being like, no, we are pretty sure that COVID was already starting to explode in China before they scrapped their policies. So it's not that they scrapped the policies and then COVID exploded. It's that their policies were failing.
Yeah.
So it could be that the CCP saw this convenient exit ramp.
A scapegoat.
Yes, in the idea that okay, well, we're going to open up as rapidly as possible. If anything bad happens, we can blame it on the protests.
Yep.
And zero COVID was perfect. It worked great for 3 years. We kept everyone so safe. And now we're so strong that COVID's just a cold, really. It's barely even the flu.
In fact, hardly anyone has died, right?
Yeah, actually.
Less than a dozen people nationwide, I think, officially.
Wow.
I had seen some expert talk about how if the U.S. was using the same criteria that the CCP was in terms of who's died of COVID, that the actual number of COVID deaths in the U.S. would be, I forget, I think 45,000 or something like that. Instead of over a million.
Wow.
That's how stringent the CCP's criteria of what has count as a COVID death is. And anecdotally, but of course, now that the CCP is trying to cover all the stuff up, we're only really going to get anecdotal information. There was somebody who was posting on Twitter about her relatives in China dying of COVID, but not being able to put that on death certificates because, according to her, funeral parlors will not take you if that's if COVID's on the death certificate. So she's so in the last 2 weeks, I've had 4 relatives die of diabetes and stroke, heart attack, but not COVID.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is footage coming out of funeral parlors with body bags stacked high. Hopefully none of them will start moving.
There was, footage of places having to use warehouses or underground parking lots to store extra bodies because there were so many bodies. It is, again, people filming this stuff
Yeah.
as a record.
Zombie apocalypse kind of stuff.
And
So There are no extra bodies here.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose if you really, really, like, you could argue that it's faked, right? Or you could argue
All
that,
those videos on Twitter are faked.
yeah.
They're full of jelly beans. Just jelly beans.
Okay, because we're back in a Looney Tunes skit.
I'm latching onto that, I guess. It's my escape from reality. Because reality is, well, yeah. So, I mean, this is very much like 2020. COVID is spreading through China. The Communist Party is in full denial mode. It's right before the Lunar New Year, and international travel is going to be a big thing.
Yeah, they're scrapping, the CCP is scrapping both inbound quarantine requirements for travelers to China, and also they're going to start letting people travel outside China again.
Yeah. So, yeah, like they have prevented people from leaving China for basically most of zero COVID.
Yeah.
And now suddenly, hey, go.
It's fine.
Go, have
Don't worry.
fun.
I mean, people, it wasn't just that there was like a ban exactly on Chinese people leaving China. You'd had to have like specific reasons you were leaving, and tourism was not one of the reasons. But also, there were so few people leaving China that like there were almost no flights, and tickets were outrageous. Like to go for like a round trip to the US or something could cost you like $5,000 or like some $10,000, like some kind of outrageous amount of money that no one would pay unless they had to for some reason.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like they're just like back at the start of the pandemic, they're pushing people to travel internationally.
Well, because I think now, like, the zero COVID dismantling happened so quickly that the propaganda apparatus almost didn't know what to do. Like they were censoring people, but like they didn't know what the actual propaganda line was for a while. Now they're saying things like, we have the correct conditions for opening up again. You know, COVID is weak and, you know, we are strong. Like all this kind of stuff about how like, if anybody is like the Western media is distorting what's happening in China, COVID is totally under control. Like it's all lies, you know. So they're now kind of going with this, and so some part of that propaganda is things like showing Chinese tourists like snowboarding in like Chinese ski resorts and being like the economy is recovering, like everything's going well now,
fine.
like everything's opened up. So of course, like, you know, they have to let people travel again.
And here we are. How do you think the world has learned anything after 2020? I mean, we still depend on China for our medical supply chain. That hasn't changed.
There were a bunch of countries that were like, we welcome Chinese tourists again. Like,
were there?
Yes, like several European countries, like France, had the like big like welcome message on Weibo or something like that, and like. But there are certain countries that are a little more hesitant, like
Italy.
Japan and Italy. Yeah, I think
Italy's policy in January 2020 was like, hug a Chinese tourist.
I don't think that was an official policy. I think that was just some stunt that someone did.
Like
that
some
it was like
cool thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that shows like they were much more open to China, and that really, I mean, Italy was really the first place outside of China that really got hit hard by COVID.
They were the first place in Europe. I think South Korea was kind of getting hit at the same time in Asia, but like in Europe, like Italy was the first place that got hit hard and the first place to really start lockdowns.
Yeah.
They locked down like Lombardy in like mid-February, something like that of 2020. And so like now there was that story about how they tested 2 planes from China like to Milan and found that almost 50% of the passengers on each plane had COVID.
Yeah, so now they're implementing mandatory testing, and the U.S. is requiring a negative test from travelers from China
before they get on the
plane. Which is interesting because this is another one of those things like where the Biden administration is doing something that essentially the Trump administration had done. Only they're not being called
it's
the horrible
similar.
racist.
It's similar. I mean, when the Trump administration had restricted travel from China.
Yeah,
but like we didn't have like mass COVID testing at the time.
There was no COVID testing at all, really.
Well, there was some, but like this was when like the CDC was really screwing up their COVID testing. I don't know if you remember this.
It was a really bad cluster.
Yeah, but anyway, so
by the way, I love the CDC. They're always right. You should listen to the CDC. Follow the link below.
The CDC is the one that just mandated the testing from China. But I was saying I saw a CNN article that did call the policy racist.
Oh, right. We did talk about
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that
So
like
I
it
would
was
say.
kind of like some experts say that like singling out China, could be, a racist, like, or like could be like discriminatory and
Who
racist.
are these
or something.
experts?
I mean, they quoted one person who was
Experts on
kind of like,
whiteness.
they quoted somebody who was like, well, like, I mean, COVID is also spreading in other parts of the world, so
Right.
why single out China? But like, there are reasons why it's different in China.
Well, because China is having a new wave, which could contain new variants that other people have not gotten immunity to yet.
At a time of mass travel, too.
Although there are experts who are also saying that like so far, like because China is being infected with Omicron variants, essentially, like people outside of China who've already been, because like all the other countries have been exposed to Omicron already, that it shouldn't be as dangerous of a situation as 2020 when like nobody had any immunity to anything.
And it was a more
Yeah.
lethal.
And like we didn't know what was happening and we didn't know how to treat it. So like it's not quite a replay of 2020. It just feels like that in a lot of
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that's a repeat is it's spreading rapidly in China. The Chinese Communist Party, for various reasons, is covering it up. There's ample information that shows that there's terrible things happening and it's being covered up. But the Chinese Communist Party is nonetheless doubling down on its cover up. And the Chinese Communist Party is, just like in January 2020, allowing and even encouraging Chinese people to go abroad from China.
Yeah. So we're off to a great start for 2023.
So welcome to the time loop.
Quantum leap, if you will.
Yes.
What does that have to
Or
do
Groundhog
with
Day.
Or Groundhog Day. We're just talking movies, Shelley.
Okay.
We're just going to mention random movies.
Involving time travel.
Yeah.
The Poseidon Adventure. It really is like the Poseidon Adventure.
Looper.
Ghost Ship.
Back to the Future.
The Abyss.
All right. Well, that's how we're feeling right now.
I guess. Well, it's a whole year and just a little over an hour. So as we wrap up 2023, welcome in the new year. You guys have any visions, goals, prophecies, revelations, or resolutions?
I think the last 3 years have taught me to not make any sorts of prophecies whatsoever, honestly. Like, it did not. Remember in the beginning of 2020 what we were doing?
Oh, visiting Taiwan.
We were
to
in
watch
Taiwan.
Democracy in action.
Yes, we were watching people count votes in like the Taiwan presidential election.
That was good.
And I remember being slightly worried as we were leaving Taiwan to go back to the U.S. because I was in the airport going, that weird virus that's in China is probably here already.
It's already in the building.
But I did not. I was thinking more like SARS, like 2003, 2004 SARS. I was not really had any idea that it could get as big as it did.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be that bad. I mean, it was going to be 2 weeks to slow the spread. But now it's been
maybe be done by
years.
April,
Yeah.
spring. Yeah, predictions not always good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, Chris, we don't have any predictions for this year.
I mean, even something like those protests that happened in China at the end of the year.
Yeah, can predict that.
Yep.
Well, how about any resolutions?
Carpe diem, because you never know.
You never know.
I feel like that was supposed to be hopeful, but actually, like, is really kind of worrying.
As I joked about on an episode, living each day like it's your last is not necessarily the most smart financial advice. Oh, that's where I was betting on 2012 being the end of the world.
Oh,
and I
yes.
lost a lot of money on that.
There you go. Yes.
Yeah. Hey, remember that? Over 10 years ago.
The Mayan calendar thing.
Yeah, 10 years after the Y2K end of the world.
Oh my gosh.
What is it about people like wanting the end of the world?
Well, I think there's something about millenniums. So like the year 2000 thing was kind of, I think, understandable. Like people thought the world was going to end at the year 1000, right? Because it was the end of the millennium.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of.
Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Matt is pushing this vampire thing. I actually don't know that much about him after a certain amount of time, and I've never seen him in the sunlight or in a mirror. Hey, after this, let's get some pizza, like really garlicky pizza.
And eat it in front of a mirror.
Yeah. That's my prediction for the new year.
What?
We'll be eating garlicky pizza in front of a mirror.
Okay. No predictions for China?
No predictions for China. What's your resolutions? Leave it in your comments below. Leave a like, because we're finally figuring out that's something you should say on YouTube, that we need likes and comments.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're really bad at promoting ourselves.
we are.
Maybe that should be our New Year's resolution.
Hey, that's a good one.
Get more people
Get
to
good.
watch.
Get good.
Get good?
And
Okay.
get smart.
Get smart. That was a good show, too. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
And join us in 2023, where Shelley will finally say Dirty Reds.
Never.